year's Equity Speaker Series. My name is Rosa Armendariz, and my pronouns are she, her, ella. I am the Dean for Student Engagement and Equity and co-chair the Student Equity Work Group with Dr. Sangha Niyogi. Each year, the Student Equity Work Group chooses a theme for our speaker series. In the past, we have had themes such as Undoing Injustice and Rise by Lifting. This year's theme is Indigeneity, Decolonize Our World, Thinking with Indigenous Studies. This year, we have invited Indigenous scholars from a range of disciplines, from different communities, to consider relationships to land, connections and solidarities across communities, and notions of home, justice, and the future. Indigenous theorizations of struggle, survival, collectivity, and resistance offer frameworks that can be helpful in addressing social problems in our communities, including those experienced by the entire planet. Participants are encouraged to attend all of the events in our series as they are designed to build our collective knowledge and facilitate conversations and future work. If you were not able to join us for the first 3 events, you can find the recordings on our webpage. The Equity Speaker Series also hopes to contribute to a vibrant and dynamic ethnic studies program at DVC. This year's theme provides us an opportunity to think about and with Indigenous studies as an important thread in relation to ethnic studies. We hope for an ethnic studies program at DVC that embraces a counter-narrative and intersectional approach, invested in the meaning-making and transformation of how we all might live, learn, and act. Please join us in this set of critical conversations that will lead us towards strategic and cohesive action. Today's event also provides us a critical opportunity to show solidarity with our Asian community who has been experiencing violence and hate crimes during this time. We are with you, and we hope that we can all stand together in action in support of our brothers and sisters. We will begin today's event with the land acknowledgement offered by Deja Gold. Born and raised in her ancestral village of Huchin, Deja is a core member of the administrative and office team of Segorite Land Trust. She works on the land with her 2 children, seed saving, planting, and harvesting. Deja is a culture keeper and leads the Chochenyo language revitalization classes for her tribe, the Confederated Villages of Lishan, Ohlone. Deja, welcome again to our event, and I'll pass it on to you.
Horshatuhi, everyone. Again, my name is Deja Gould. I'm very happy to give this land acknowledgement to you all today. And I hope that it brings a better connection with my people and all of you. So on behalf of the Confederated Villages of Lishan, we welcome you from one of our home territories of Taklan, which is also Bay Miwok territory, the lands that we have an unbroken tie to since the beginning of time. We welcome our honored Tongva and Lucenio guests, Dr. Theresa Ambo and Professor of Art, Rick Godinez. And please do forgive me if I've pronounced your names wrong. We thank you for bringing your gifts of knowledge to us today, and welcome to everyone who is here to listen and learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Deja. And before handing over the program, a reminder that all of the information on our speaker series, including past recordings, are on our webpage. And we also want to remind you to fill out the survey about our event because your feedback is important as we continue to build. And we will post the tiny URL for easy access at the very end of today's event. And now I hand it over to my colleague, Professor Diane Lawrence. Turning it over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Rosa, and hello, everyone. My name is Diane Lawrence, and my pronouns are she, her. I teach chemistry here at DVC at the San Ramon campus. We are thrilled to partner with educators, scholars, and community leaders, Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, who have been facilitating the series in partnership with team members from the Sogorea Te Land Trust. Eve Tuck is Canada Research Chair of Indigenous Methodology with Youth and Communities, and Associate Professor of Critical Race and Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. Kay Wayne Yang is Provost of John Muir College and Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Welcome, Eve and Wayne.
Hey, y'all. Just a quick hello. You'll see us again at the Q&A, and if you've been tuning in for the whole series, we should be familiar faces. Hi, Eve.
Hi, Wayne. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, all of you, for attending today. And I appreciate that we began by expressing our solidarity and our outrage at the attack on Asian and Asian American people today. I know that so many of us are both grieving and rageful, and I hope that this afternoon can be a way of reaffirming connections between Indigenous people and Asian communities, between Asian people and Black communities, and know that this violence is reprehensible.
Thank you, Eve and Wayne. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome not one, but two speakers to the Equity Speaker Series. Our first speaker is Theresa Jean Ambo, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Education Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Her research examines historical and contemporary relationships between public universities and local Native nations in California, and offers transferable insight on tribal university relationships and partnerships. Theresa is Tonga and Louisiano and holds a PhD and an MED in education and a BA in American Indian Studies from UCLA. Our second speaker is Rick Godinez, a fellow faculty member of mine at the San Ramon campus of DVC. Rick is a visual artist, painter, and professor of art. Rick holds a BFA from San Jose State University and an MFA from Stanford University. His work deals with themes of history, identity, and power. He has exhibited his work at many different sites in the Bay Area and on the East Coast, and many are on display on the walls around our campus, and I always really enjoy seeing his artwork. Unfortunately, Rick is not able to join us in person today, but he has recorded his part of the talk, and the link will be found on our website in the near future. So I encourage you to visit our website and view his talk. Rick will be attending the debrief circle on Friday. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker today, Theresa Jean Ambo, to begin her talk, which is entitled Monumental Implications, Land, Acknowledgments, Monuments. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, and everyone. Hello. I first want to send a heartfelt thank you to Deja for the welcome. And I think something that's really important to say is our ancestors moved along the coast since time immemorial. So it's really likely that we have some sort of connection or relation between us, either through trade or intermarriage. And I really appreciate you welcoming me and pronouncing my last name right as well for this talk in particular. I think our ancestors would be really happy today, dancing and rejoicing that we are able to make this connection online, even if it is via Zoom. And I also want to thank Dr. Tuck and Dr. Yang and all the faculty and the staff at Diablo Valley College for bringing us together and for inviting me to speak. I recognize there are a lot of people that could have been a part of this series. And so I really want to take a moment to lift you both up and everybody else up at DVC. And thank you all for giving me the opportunity as a little baby scholar, is what I like to consider myself. And And then I'd also like to thank my family, friends, colleagues, and even a couple of my students who joined in today. And then thank you to everybody who's on the call for taking time in your lives to listen and think with me. You know, we're in a pandemic. Our country is going through a lot of very public, very, very apparent and some obvious ongoing injustices. And so I hope that this talk is helpful in terms of how you're thinking and feeling at the moment and provides you some solace or refuge for what's going on. So for those of you that don't know me, hello, mi-yu-yum. I'm Theresa Ambo, and I'm Zooming from Carlsbad, which is located in my home territory that we share with the Kumeyaay Nation. Before moving to San Diego County, I lived my entire life in Los Angeles and moved between La Puente, West LA, and Long Beach. I am very proud to be a Tongva and Luiseña woman, and I'm thankful that I lived my entire life in my homelands and that I still am able to say that. When I was young, I never really understood its significance, but I always knew that I was home. It was something that I always felt. I always knew that I was on the land of my ancestors, that my family had been on that land for as long as I knew. And now that I'm older, I realize how significant it is and it is to live on these lands. I remember at one time when I was at UCLA, I was talking with friends about being Indian in Los Angeles and how difficult it can be to be absorbed and erased in the concrete and the urban sprawl. But at the same time, I didn't really, I couldn't entirely relate, and I recognized that I didn't entirely share their experience, because between all the highways and skyscrapers and the smog and the cars and the pavement and all the people, I knew innately that I was still looking at the same sky and the sun and the same moon and stars as my ancestors from the place that they did. And I was swimming in that same ocean. And I'm not a very athletic person, but I always knew on the few occasions that I did it, that I was hiking and walking the same hills and the same mountains that they once did. And people always love to complain about Los Angeles, whether they're tourists or visiting or settlers to the area. They always love to say how they hate the city. They hate the privilege that juxtaposes with the poverty. They hate the people and their pretentiousness. And of course, everybody loves to talk about how they hate the traffic. And I always, and excuse my language, but I always want to ask them to not shit on my homelands. You know, to be a visitor, to be a guest, to be a settler in LA is a particular privilege and experience. And I don't know if people recognize that these lands are really sacred to other people. And so while the city is very different from what it once was because of colonization, it holds the same spirit for us as it always has. And we see that spirit and we see the land in a way that other people don't or can't and will never be able to. And so I want to start by letting you all know about me and where I'm from. And I share this because this entirely shapes the work that I do and what I'll talk about with you today. As Diane mentioned, I'm currently an assistant professor at UC San Diego. And here's a little bit of my family. And I'm currently assistant professor at UC San Diego in the Department of Education Studies, where I have the privilege of being colleagues with Dr. Yang. And before moving to UC San Diego for a postdoc, I was at UCLA for 15 cumulative years, where I worked in student affairs and I completed a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. So my entire life experience as a Tongva woman and my experience of navigating that institution where they are complicit and beneficiaries to my community's erasure profoundly changed and shaped my life and my work. And at some point, I became very curious about the relationship that the universities have with Native nations, specifically my community. And so I decided to make a career out of it. And it's my line of research. And this is really what I'll talk with you about today. So my goals for today is to speak very practically for those of you in the audience about the ways that universities can respectfully engage Native nations and people, whether it's a community, a nation, your colleague, or your students in your class or at your institution. The recommendations that I'll provide are what scholars, or what I like to call empirically conceptually rooted, meaning they're grounded in empirically rigorous research to offer practical recommendations for people in the field, specifically leaders, faculty, and practitioners in higher education. And so I want to note that as I progress through the talk, I will focus on universities and Native nations broadly, but I want you all to consider and understand that this can be applied both to organizations and individuals at either level. And so I want to start us off with a little bit of reflection and thinking. And I want to start off with this quote by Janice Gould. She's a Maidu poet. And the quote reads, "It is obvious there is not a university in this country that is not built on what was once native land. We should reflect on this over and over and understand this as one fundamental point about the relationships of Indians to academia." And so this was in 1992. And I think that Janice would reword the quote to say what is and will always be native land. But nevertheless, the quote drives home the point about the importance of relationships between Native people and academia, or Native people and their land, which is currently occupied by these institutions. And so I ask you all to pause for a moment to reflect on your relationships and to take stock of your institution's relationships. And now I ask you to focus on the relationships that you and your institution hold with Native nations and people. You might be asking yourself, and hopefully after the welcome, not as much, but you might be asking yourself, who are the first people of this place? Where are they in physical presence? What does enrollment of Native students look like? How many Native faculty and staff do we have? What local Native nations do we engage and how? And possibly you might be asking yourself, what can I do? And I think that these are really important and necessary questions that everyone should ask themselves, no matter what your walk of life and no matter what your position is whatever your position is in academia. It's really my belief, or rather my hope and my prayer, that a deep examination of our relationships with Native people and places can have monumental implications. So before jumping into these practical recommendations, I want to take a moment to provide a little bit of context about California and Native education in the state. You may or may not know that the area now known as the state of California is home to the largest number of American Indians and sovereign Native nations. According to the US Census in 2010, there are approximately 3.8 million American Indian people in the US, and there are approximately 723,000 of these individuals in California. Additionally, there are 574 federally recognized Native nations in the US, and 109 of these nations are located within the state boundaries. Many, or several, not many, several of which share territories with Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and Mexico. And this, of course, doesn't account for nearly 40 non-federally recognized Native nations located across the state, and particularly along the California coastline, which there's a history to that that's really long and complicated, and for another time. So shifting our focus to education, it's important to note that American Indians across the US are primarily enrolled in public secondary education. And as a result, and there's probably some sort of statistical association, it's more likely that Native students will attend public institutions of higher education. So in 2016, 16.3 million students were enrolled in higher education across the US, and approximately 129,000 of those students were American Indian. And when we specifically focus on California in 2010, approximately 15,000 of these students, Native students, were enrolled at California community colleges. 2,000 were enrolled across the CSU system, and 1,539 were enrolled at the UC, across 10 UC campuses, combined as undergraduates and graduates. And so actually it's 1,162 undergraduates were across 10 campuses, and 377 were graduate students across all the UCs. And so now that we have a little bit of the lay of the land, I want to take a moment to think about these numbers. They are embarrassingly low, and I think that you would agree with that. At all the institutions, less than 1% of the students enrolled are American Indian, which is really troubling given that the mission of public schools is to be public serving institutions. Woven into institutional missions is the responsibility to serve all communities. And so inherently included in that are American Indian students. However, based on the numbers alone, we can see that this is happening at very low rates, alarmingly low rates. And arguably, I believe that if our institutions are not serving Native students, they are not serving Native nations. I want to take a moment to point you to these two reports that were produced by Drs. Jolie Proudfit and Theresa Greger through this CSU San Marcos California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center, if you have any interest in knowing more about American Indian Alaska Native education in the state of California specifically. Moving forward, I want to point out the responsibility of public education to Indigenous people and the fact that this necessity is further elevated when we consider how historical events and policies actively attempted to eliminate Indigenous people, and how institutions are actually beneficiaries of this history, whether they're tied to it or not. And so this chart is not comprehensive, it's just a small snapshot, but I did want to show how these events kind of stagger or scaffold and are really interwoven or intimately connected. If you look at this, you can see there's a very intentional and very strategic effort by the US and California governments to remove Indigenous people from their land, and how settler colonial education has benefited from these events. For example, in the 1862 Morrill Act and the 1868 Organic Act, which created the UC system, directly benefited from the 1850 Act for the Government and the Protection of Indians, which allowed for the indenturement of California Native people. These institutions also benefited from treaty making with Native nations in California that occurred between 1851 and 1852. And these treaties were actually never ratified. They were rejected in a secret session by the Senate. And so there's so many other historical events that allowed for the removal and erasure of Indigenous peoples from their land so that institutions can be built and made. Not too long ago in 2019, Governor Newsom issued an apology to California Indians for, quote unquote, the historical wrongdoings of the state. And then just last year in August of 2020, former UC President Janet Napolitano also issued a statement of apology regarding repatriation or lack thereof by UC campuses. Arguably, and you can differ in opinion, acknowledgments and apologies are not restitution or reconciliation for this history. Nothing can undo genocide, violence, or harm that has been inflicted and continues to be inflicted onto Native people. Nothing can really repair this damage, and nothing can make the past right. It's simply not possible, but moving forward, institutions can do what is right by Indigenous people. And so you'll note that I said, do right by Indigenous people. Working within institutions, I often hear people say, leaders say, we want to do the right thing. And when I was new to this game, new to the institution, I thought, okay, this is good, you know, they really want to do the right thing, only to realize eventually that we had very different understandings of what is right and for whom. And so over the last few years, there actually have been a lot of policies in California that have been passed to usher institutions into the direction of doing what's right by holding institutions accountable for engaging with Native communities and righting historical wrongs. So a few examples of this are AB 2836, on Native American repatriation, AB 275 on Native American cultural preservation, and a new UC policy on repatriation and cultural affiliation. All these policies call for institutions to be compliant with repatriation policies or practices of repatriation and return our ancestors and our cultural material home that has been used by institutions for research, museum exhibitions, and simply being collected for the sake of being collected. Being compliant with policies is actually what I believe the minimum that institutions can do. And many of our institutions aren't even doing that. And so really the rest of my talk is catered to talking about a little bit about what institutions are doing, but really trying to push institutions to do more and to do better and to do the right thing by Native people. And so very quickly, I do want to point you all into the direction of this expose. If you have not already read this expose in High Country News, I encourage you to check it out. In their research, journalist Tristan Antone and historian Robert Lee identify 10.7 million acres of indigenous land across 24 states, including California, and showed that less than $400,000 was paid for native land, which in turn raised $17.7 million for university endowments. This research is really significant because it provides an undeniable, unrefutable connection between universities or Morel Act universities or land grant universities and indigenous dispossession. And it makes apparent how universities profited, but also continue to profit from indigenous people. And I would add that this month, the Journal of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association published responses to this research as well. And I was very fortunate to be invited to contribute to the issue and offer some additional details about California and its history in relationship to land grant institutions. And so I also encourage you to check that out if you have any sort of interest in it. And so now I want to provide a little bit of context about California and want to turn to some of my research that examines the state of tribal university relationships or relationships with Native nations, or rather actually the lack thereof. And this section should contextualize some of the practical recommendations that I'll provide for you all. Over the years, I've read a number of reports from Native scholars who say we must form relationships with Native nations, or we must honor the treaties. And I agree, yes, we do. But every day I watch institutions, my institution in particular, fumble again and again to work with Native nations and to adequately support Native students and students of color and communities of color too. And so while I find the recommendations to be appropriate and necessary, something that has bothered me over the years is the lack of guidance provided to people, especially university leaders who are responsible for fostering relationships. About 5 years ago, I decided to take an empirical approach to understanding tribal university relationships and conducted case studies at two of our state's flagship institutions. And so I want to mention, there are several Native scholars that examine college experience, college access, retention, graduation, and I appreciate their work and point you to these scholars if you are interested in knowing more about college student experience. But that issue and looking at students really wasn't for me. I was really compelled to examine the institution or institutions through an organizational approach, be it looking at behavior, decision-making, leadership, what have you. And I feel like I was really called to this work because of my experience as a student activist and a practitioner in student affairs. I was really tired of research, whether it was deficit or anti-deficit, that implied certain things about our students. And for me, I thought we need systemic change, and systemic change doesn't need to start with our students. It needs to start with the institution, which I acknowledge for many of us that are working within the institution, it can often seem very impossible. And so I did case study research. I looked at 2 institutions, and I was able to sit down with leaders, Native and non-Native at the university to have conversations about tribal university relationships. And I was really shocked, but I was also really hurt and saddened to hear what came out of some people's mouths. When I asked university leaders about the state of relationships, and excuse me, I'm gonna go over to this. When I asked them about the state of relationships, one person said to me, "I'm not aware of tribes in the immediate area," which demonstrated to me their limited knowledge of Native nations and Native people, that they didn't even know we were present in the campus, in the vicinity of the campus, or that the campus was occupying our land. Another person shared with me, for the most part, the university doesn't really have any kind of hardwire relationship with any tribal communities, which said to me that institutional relationships with Native nations did not exist. And of course, these are corroborated, these are just quotes, but they're corroborated across all interviews. And then, as I talked to more people and asked this question, another person shared with me, the university only has relationships with tribes if it's mandated to. Which said to me a total disregard for meaningful, proactive engagement with Native communities and nations as a part of the institutional mission or institutional relationships. And the last thing I want to share with this is, one participant shared with me, there are a few tribes in California that now have resources. That's when the university suddenly gets interested in tribal nations, when they have resources. Then suddenly they want to have a relationship with them, which is ironic. Which spoke with this particular quote and related quotes to this spoke to me about this continued exploitation of Indigenous communities by universities. And so for many of you, this might not be surprising. Many of us know this, and we know these perspectives exist. We know that there's a tenuous relationship that's rooted in this history between universities and Native nations. And so my goal here, because for many of us, this is obvious. My goal here was not to state the obvious, but to intervene and shine a light on these perspectives. One of my committee members and a mentors of mine, Dr. Brayboy, often says in his presentations, you have to remind the university of what they say. And so this is that for me, to document what is being said by institutional leaders so that we can then say, this is not acceptable ever, and this is not acceptable anymore. And so these findings push me to these practical recommendations for you all and for institutions. Bringing together this research with research in other fields, I developed this 10-point framework. It's not perfect, it needs tweaks. I'm doing a third case study to corroborate these particular points. But this framework is really geared around advancing relationships with Native nations at the organizational level. And so these principles, if you're working within the institution and trying to figure out how to do this, I will say these principles are not a step-by-step guide. They're not a checklist for fostering relationships. Instead, this should be seen as a set of principles essential for engaging Native nations and people that need to be iteratively engaged. My goal here is really twofold. One, these principles provide guidance to those within the institution, particularly non-Native leaders with little sense of how to engage Native nations or people. And simultaneously, these principles are offering to Native people who are in the institution and often tasked with the responsibility of guiding these relationships so that they can have a framework and guidelines on how they're advising their university. And so the rest of my remarks will focus on 4 specific points of this framework. I decided to focus on these 4 principles today because of my work the last year as a faculty and as interim repatriation coordinator at UCSD. And so we'll talk about re-education, recognizing or recognition, responsibility, and resources. And so as I mentioned in my work, I learned that university leaders working with or desiring to work with Native communities needed to be educated, or rather re-educated, on Indigenous people. So this isn't anyone's fault per se, and in fact, I think that the lack of knowledge about Indigenous people is honestly reflective of the role schooling has, and it continues to have, in the settler colonial project. You don't know about Indigenous people for a reason. And the reality is that Indigenous people are really rarely discussed in public curriculum or secondary curriculum. If you're a product of the California State Public Education System, it is very likely that you only heard about Indigenous people twice in all of your schooling. And that was in the 4th grade when you were taught about the mission system and then US history. And in US history, it was very likely that you didn't hear about California Native people and the lands that you were on. You heard about contact and Indigenous people on the East Coast and colonization as it occurred over there. Because by the time we got west, the narrative that is retold and perpetuated through schooling is that Native people vanished, they were gone, they were erased. And so you only heard about Native people very likely twice in all of your education. And so I often get the question, like, how do we not put responsibility on Indigenous people or people of color to educate us? And I'm currently leading a training for an equity training for the San Diego Grantmakers Foundation, and actually received this question last week. And so I think it's well-meaning, and I think it's an appropriate question. And my response to them that I'll share with you all is, if you want to be supportive of your Indigenous colleagues, students, and local communities, you must educate yourself and re-educate yourself. You know, it's not appropriate to rely on or expect Indigenous people to educate you. And we need to stop playing on or playing up outdated stereotypes and tropes of Indigenous people. As people not Indigenous to this land, I encourage you to do the preparation required to respectfully engage Indigenous people. So this might sound very simple, and it might sound like common sense, but we all know common sense is not very common. So my suggestion to you is several. Read a book, and you should read a book by an Indigenous scholar. And I would push it even further, if you're in California, if you're at DVC, to read a book by a California Indian author. And this slide shows a number of books by California Indian authors or Indigenous authors. I also encourage you to take an American Indian Studies course or enroll in a class at your local tribal college. There's California Tribal College in the north and Kumeyaay Community College in the south. And they're always accepting enrollments and welcome other people who want to learn about California Native communities. You might also consider attending another workshop or public lecture like you're doing now, or visiting a cultural center in your area that is managed by a local Native nation, where they're controlling the narrative and the story and the history of their community. And when you're comfortable, you should consider attending a public community gathering, and so not only supporting the community, but going out into the community and engaging with these individuals who are there. Next, I want to talk about recognition. So once you, or rather your institution, know a bit more about the community you desire to engage, I suggest that your institution works to acknowledge the local Native community. And so to be clear, I'm not saying that universities should write or offer land acknowledgements. I'm not saying they should, and I'm not saying they shouldn't. But what I will say is what we've learned from our neighbors to the north, land acknowledgements are susceptible to becoming empty and rote gestures. There's a lot of scholarship from amazing scholar activists that talk about these tensions that are occurring in Canada because of the acknowledgement process not being tied to anything. And so while I know that land acknowledgement practices are growing in popularity and have multiple functions, I want to say we need to go beyond rhetoric, and we need to go beyond performance and realize that anything short of material commitments, resources, and sustained engagement is really a perfunctory gesture. And so what I do suggest is a recognition of an institution's history. Institutions really need to understand the long history of their campus and how it came to be. And undoubtedly, it'll be uncovered that institutions are tied to heinous policies and violent acts of Indigenous dispossession. And once these histories are understood, I implore universities or institutions to not seek out excuses or alibis that absolve them of this history and their complacency with it, but to recognize and atone for their institution's connection to the legal and unjust acquisition of unceded territory. And to also be accountable for decades of complacency. This is not a call to do more, it's really a call to do what's right by Indigenous people. I think, you know, the timing and what is going on in our country right now, that's more visible. It's been going on for a long time, but people on a different scale are trying to reckon with the social and racial history and the conditions of inequity that are really baked into our institution. And so not too long ago, I was in a faculty breakfast with our chancellor, and he asked, like, how do we get to the root of this problem? And I bit my tongue throughout the whole conversation because I knew that my opinion was going to be unpopular, but I continued to grow more and more unsatisfied with the direction the conversation was going. And so I interjected and I said, we cannot address racial and social injustice without a recognition that colonization is the foundation of this nation. I didn't even get into settler colonialism because I know we weren't there yet. But of course, this comment was received with a bunch of blank Zoom faces, and it looked like people were uncomfortable and shifting in their seats. But it's this recognition that is necessary by institutions. And so, you know, being uncomfortable momentarily, it's temporary for leaders and institutions, but it's a necessary part of engaging Native communities. Along with recognition of a history, I also implore that institutions recognize the sovereignty of Native nations and to recognize the authority of tribal governments and elected leaders of these nations. So while it's likely that you work with Indigenous people, I want to push you and encourage you and plead that you foster government to government relationships with Native nations that recognize, that reinforce, and that respect tribal sovereignty and self-determination. We must seek out leaders of communities of these nations, and colleges really need to stop leaving Indigenous people out of the conversation when all this planning is taking place. And when we are a part of these conversations, institutions need to stop talking about us without us present. And so these recognitions need to happen, what is transpiring at our institutions. Next, I want to talk a little bit about responsibility. And so I have two more, and then I'll be finished with my talk. So not only do institutions need to accept responsibility for their history, they also need to engage Native nations and Indigenous students as a part of their espoused missions. So presently, higher education institutions are accountable to internal and external constituencies, including federal and state governments, governing and accrediting boards. And increasingly, we're having to be more accountable to private donors. And so arguably, Indigenous people, given our history of dispossession and given how institutions have financially benefited from Indigenous lands, have contributed more to higher education per capita than any other person or any other community, yet we receive the fewest benefits. And so given that institutions have financially profited from Indigenous lands in some way, Indigenous people can and should be viewed as financial contributors to universities, as essentially stakeholders. And this really calls on institutions to consider who they are accountable to, or rather, what I would like to say is who they should be responsible to. And finally, my last recommendation, and I think Dr. Tuck, you retweeted this a couple weeks ago. In the process of re-educating ourselves, of working towards recognition and understanding what responsibility should look like, we also need to recognize that this work cannot be done without resources. And so I acknowledge that the allocation of resources doesn't fix a problem and that we need systemic change. But at the same time, budgets reflect priorities, period. And so I want to bring your attention back to those numbers that we looked at the beginning of this talk around American Indian student enrollment. The low numbers, and so I want to make a point. The low numbers of Native students is commensurate to the number of Native faculty and staff, which is to say there's a very small population on all of our campuses of Native people across faculty, staff, and students. And so arguably, and this is really for your consideration, any investment in campus programs and community engagement initiatives would really not come at a great financial cost to institutions, given our low numbers. And so it actually shouldn't be such a burden for institutions to do this. And I also want to point to new policies on repatriation again, which have written into them language on the allocation of resources, requiring that institutions allocate funds to these efforts. Institutions are essentially legally obligated to do this work and allocate resources now because they have neglected this responsibility in the past. And now they're being put on notice to allocate Now that they're being put on notice and being required to allocate resources, it feels like we feel like we're bleeding a stone essentially, and it's so hard to extract resources from the institution when they've extracted so much from our communities. There's also this ongoing assumption or stereotype that all Native communities have casinos, which is particularly pervasive in California, where there are a large number of Native nations who exercise tribal sovereignty through economic development efforts. And this phenomena has made institutions start to look at Native nations for resources, but there has been and is little commitment by these institutions or guaranteed benefits to these communities. And so we must recognize that there is an insensitivity to this practice. And not only have universities been complacent in their history, not only have they excluded and long ignored these communities and students, but now they're asking for Native people to foot the bill. And that's just not right. And so I'll close my remarks by circling back to this quote that we began with by Janice Gould. To better build relationships with Native communities, students, and your colleagues, we need to do the following. We need to understand the land and its first people. We need to know the history that transpired on that land. And we need to prepare our institutions to confront this legacy and commit to the community in various ways. These efforts combined, along with a host of others, can have monumental implications for universities, but I think perhaps more importantly, these actions can have monumental implications for Native nations and their tribal members. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Ambo.
Yeah, sorry that we are in Zoom and not with you in a room to be able to share our appreciation with applause and lots of words of congratulations. But please know that there's so many people in the call who are just with you right now and so appreciative of what you've just shared with us, and also looking to get into a conversation with you. And so you can use the Q&A function. Those of you who are attending today's webinar can use the Q&A function in order to pose a question. And my dear colleague and I, Wayne Yang, and I will also offer some questions and thoughts along the way. You definitely have shared research and compelling insights on a topic that is so close to my heart. I'm like bursting with things to talk with you about, and some of that will happen here, and I'm sure some of it will happen for many years after today. So thank you for that work.
Thank you.
And I mean, I have so many questions. I don't know where to start. I guess I'll just start by saying I really appreciated that you had that stolen land from image from bamboo. And I guess I'll start with repatriation. So it's something we've been talking about. So I think you were gesturing at how universities have a lot of have come to accumulate and possess like the actual ancestors, as well as cultural materials from the various indigenous tribes. And people don't even know that their university might have these. So I'm not trying to call out Diablo Valley College, but I know Diablo Valley College is working on through its own things that it has accumulated over time. You had mentioned a couple of specific laws, AB 236 and AB 275. And I felt like these would be useful for people to understand, like what do the actual laws say, and how do these laws facilitate or deter the repatriation of ancestors and cultural materials?
A law question. Thanks, Wayne.
Or maybe you could tell us more. I mean, I know if you feel comfortable that you're involved with dealing with repatriation very directly, and I know if there's anything you can share about that, or past involvements that are more appropriate to share at this point.
Yeah, well, I will say the two assembly bills that were passed in California were promoted, lobbied, and put forward by Native communities in California. One of the most influential being Pechanga, Band of Luiseño Indians. And so these bills really put pressure, particularly on the UC system, to be compliant with NAGPRA. And so historically, a lot of our institutions have been able to skirt the responsibility of responding to the mandates that are outlined in NAGPRA. And NAGPRA itself is actually criticized quite a bit. NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that was passed in 1990. And so a lot of people critique the policy because there isn't a lot of teeth to it, I guess. And so while it mandates that institutions report on their holdings, there's not any sort of penalty or consequences to that. And so these bills that were just passed in the new UC repatriation and cultural affiliation policy really puts pressure on institutions, particularly the UC, to become compliant with NAGPRA and California NAGPRA. And that's really, again, I would go back to my points about education and re-education. If you are working with repatriation at your institution, it's really simple to read a policy. It's a few pages to understand the rules and regulations and expectations outlined in it. And I could share a little bit about my work around repatriation at UC San Diego. For a long time, there was a story or rhetoric going around our system at UC San Diego didn't have any sort of ancestral remains after we did a repatriation to the Kumeyaay Nation. And it was revealed in June of last year that that is not true. And so we can't talk about it all too much, but all to say, we do have ancestors. And in accordance with these new policies, our institution is starting to do a campus-wide inventory. Every nook, every cranny, every cupboard, every closet will need to be inspected. Institutional leaders, department heads will be required to report any sort of holdings that they have. And I think that all the institutions in the UC are going to be surprised at what they have, especially those without museums where these collections are housed, because the foundation of many of these institutions are tied to anthropology, archaeology, are connected to development in some construction in some way. And so there is very likely that our ancestors and the ancestors of other communities are all across our campus and need to be respectfully returned. So hopefully I got to some of your question, Wayne.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to jump in?
Sure. One of the things that I really appreciate about how you framed your talk, you said this quite early in your talk, but I think it just had so many resonances across, was the idea that the kind of harm that has happened through indigenous dispossession, through removals in order to build universities, that what you said is there's nothing that can repair that damage. There's nothing that can make the past right. And I feel like that reminds me very much of what I'm learning from Safanit Habtom and from Jade Nixon as they're engaging Saidiya Hartman's understandings of rupture, and that there's things that can't be healed. And so working then with that idea of, okay, so then what do we do? What is the ask, or what is the demand of the university when we know that the university cannot be made innocent again, and that the goal is not to erase or accept an apology, or to have a plaque, or to have a land acknowledgement, that like the kind of monumental harm does not then get a monument. And so I wanted to invite you to talk more then about how you see that idea playing out then in these ideas of responsibility and these ideas of even education. Like many of the materials that are available and are state sanctioned in curriculum are not going to begin with that as the premise. They'll begin with an idea of reconciliation as possible. And so sending people off on their way to just read more is maybe a tricky solution.
No, I really appreciate the question, and I do understand, or I do see that some of the principles in my framework that I am putting forward, like they are insufficient in terms of addressing some of these issues or concerns.
That's not what I said.
No. I mean, I'm acknowledging that. No, they're like, no, I'm acknowledging that like reading more isn't necessarily a solution, right? And we have to be critical consumers of what we are reading, right? And so I could tell you like, go read a book, and it's like an easy solution. It's a part of a solution, but it's not going to fix everything. And so I will share, why I included that in this talk. And I think I have a friend actually who's on this call, Kenneth Ramos. We have a design-based research project that looks at the temporal and spatial history of Mak'kuluhui, which is the village that UC San Diego is located on. And we meet monthly to talk about the relationship to land and what stories we want to be told. And we actually had we were looking at research questions and doing this co-design process. And one of the participants, one of the Kumeyaay community scholars, Eva Trujillo, who's from Mesa Grande, she was the person who made this comment. And at the time, I was in a place to receive it, because I hear this comment come from other community members, right? The harm that institutions have done is irreparable. We can't fix the past. And so she made a comment to that extent. And it really resonated with me and why I included it in the talk. And so I don't think that, like you made a comment, like made innocent again, these institutions. And I don't think our institutions were ever innocent. And so that's something to think about. And I also think that it's so complex and there's so many tensions and limitations of the institution. And so I do think that there are things that institutions can do to not to make right, but to move forward. And I don't think they'll ever be able to really heal the wound that they've created in the community. One thing I will say is I would just like institutions to stop harming us presently, because they are actively inflicting violence and actively harming us like today in this very moment. Our ancestors are in museums. Our ancestors are in collections, in laboratories. They're being tested. And so I think a good way of moving forward is to to work with the community on how to stop and have a conversation around like what steps do we need to take as an institution so that we're not inflicting harm on you moving forward, but we're actually walking together in the same direction, maybe not holding hands. Maybe we're never going to converge. Maybe we'll never have the same goals, but how do we move forward from the place that we are at or from this history, knowing that we can't ever go back and right the wrongs of our institution. So I don't know if that gets to your.
It really does. You know, I think a lot about, I work in Canada now after having started my career as a professor in the United States, and I moved to Canada in order to start working here just after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its calls to action. And I think a lot about what it means for there to be more and more spaces created for Indigenous students and for Indigenous faculty and staff. But in order to get to the First Nations house, they have to cross in front of the mining department or the mining building. And so that there are simultaneous investments that universities are making in the fossil fuel industry, in covering over climate change, in investments in policing on campus that are actively harming Indigenous communities at the same time that they're making these investments is a really hard contradiction to bear. I love that you used the tweet from Dr. Megan Scribe, who is a recent PhD graduate from September 2020 and also is an assistant professor at Ryerson University. I think I did retweet that tweet about if universities want to repair Indigenous relations, they need to start in the finance department. And I love where you went with that. But when I retweeted it, I thought that it meant literally, like, why does it take so long to get the Kukum her honorarium check? Like, why does it take so long for universities to process the invoice for the speaker fee or for like pay for the pizza at the meeting? And so there's just all these ways that the university invites very precarious relationships that Indigenous people can have with the university, but then treats the payment for it or I lost the word, but the compensation, treats it as though it is immaterial in the lives of Indigenous people, treats it as though it's an afterthought or something that can be so slow. Mm-hmm. And so there's also these little ways that disrespect is so present in relationships between universities and Indigenous people as individuals.
Yeah, something that I didn't mention and that is just getting a little too long, but a lot of times like these little what we would see as minor requests, but institutions don't compensate Native people. It's an assumption that they don't have a full-time job, that they want to come and be speakers. And so there's also this level of disrespect and dismissiveness of Native people in assuming that they want to come to your event to do an acknowledgement and that they don't have a full-time job, or that they want their issues and their concerns to be heard, so they'll speak on a panel for free. And there's never an appropriate level of compensation that's commensurate with the knowledge and the knowledge that that Indigenous person is bringing when they come to campus and when they offer to sit on a panel or agree to an invitation.
I mean, I think that really dovetails. I had not thought of it that way, where you said, Indigenous people have contributed more per capita to higher education. When you think about all the land theft and how true that is, that there is like, first accountability to that, but also to to continue to ask for more resources is actually a relationship of exploitation. I also, think that, this is something going back to, I think you're pointing out like the education of people in positions of leadership in higher education, of which I am one, I will admit, and educating people on not only people educating themselves, not only on who the local tribes are, whose land you're on, but also to develop at least institutional protocols that start to build upon that acknowledgement, right? So whether it's like you said, there is no appropriate compensation, but more than zero is good, and there are amounts that at least are respectful of people's time, if not the total expertise and wisdom that has been learned over so many generations. And I feel like one thing I appreciate about this series was is from the Dean of Student Engagement Equity and the groups working on this is trying to have those conversations, and working with Segoriate and partnering. One thing I feel, and I guess this is my question, is and this relates to a question in the chat, for like non-federally recognized tribes, and the nature of institutional relationships to tribes that for which there is no ratified treaty, or for which the federal government refuses to recognize them. What have you seen as positive steps that an institution can take beyond what has already been laid out by federal recognition, or not laid out by federal recognition?
Yeah. So in my research, I did do a comparative analysis of relationships between, that was like a mouthful, sorry. But I looked at what is the institution's relationship with federally recognized as opposed to non-federally recognized. And I did talk to communities, and by and large, I talked to members of non-federally recognized communities. And so something that I did find based off of people's level of knowledge and education about Native communities, like they never recognized that they never had a recognition for a non-federally recognized community in the vicinity of their institution, right? Like we just didn't exist to them. Outside, like when it came to institutional leaders, when it came to individuals who were within Native programs, there was that recognition. And so I do think that like, because institutions only have relationships with local Native nations, or primarily with local Native nations that are federally recognized because of laws, because they're obligated to, I do think, and because non-federally recognized tribes aren't included in these federal laws, then oftentimes we're left out. And so I think that when institutions are thinking about institutional relationships, government and community relations, like there needs to be an understanding and a recognition that such and such federally recognized tribe is down the street, but that doesn't mean that this community is not a sovereign Native nation. Oftentimes people look at non-federally recognized groups in a particular way, and we need to recognize that they are still sovereign nations, right? And so any sort of respect, any sort of engagement that you would give to a non-federally recognized group, I mean, to a federally recognized group, should also be given to a non-federally recognized group. And then I'm biased, but I also have to say that I think that UCLA has done an incredible job of engaging the Tongva community and its various bands and organizations as a non-federally recognized community, because there's a number of groups within the Tongva Nation, and there's a number of community organizations like the Tiat Society. And I think that Mashana Goldman, Wendy Teeter, Shannon Speed, the individuals at that institution are doing their due diligence. They're meaningfully engaging the community across the board. They're not just choosing one community to privilege over the other. They're trying to be transparent, and they're trying to be very communicative and inclusive of of all groups within that nation. And so I would encourage people to look to UCLA and those Indigenous women and allies who are doing that work with non-federally recognized communities.
There's also an interesting question to chat that I think is like a strategy, and maybe you're not able to speak to it because it's speculative, but someone's asking if there are state recognized nations that are not federally recognized. I'm not aware of that in California, but I know other states have that. And I think their question is driving at, then is it possible then to have California Indian specific scholarships? Like I know at our university, you could probably speak on that, we have a tribal membership initiative, but it doesn't apply to non-federally recognized tribes.
Yes, it does. Now it does.
Oh, it does.
And so I think that institutions, they need to look at lineage and descendancy. And I know that enrollment is important. And I know that we have a very pervasive issue in our community around ethnic fraud. But I also think that there are possibilities of including those from non-federally recognized or state recognized communities in some of the initiatives that are being developed. And so I'm from two non-federally recognized communities. I would want the same access to the same resources as my counterparts who are from federally recognized tribes. But our institution, UC San Diego, does have a scholarship for undergraduate and graduate students called the Tribal Membership Initiative. And starting last academic year, they started offering it to individuals who are descendants of tribes, whether it's federally recognized or non-federally recognized.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I know there are initiatives. There's a advisory group to the UC president who is working on an initiative to have I believe it's in-state tuition for all American Indian students, whether they're out of state or not. And I know that the California Indian Alliance on Education, I believe that's the title for it. At one point, they did put an initiative up for tuition waivers for Native students. But these are long issues that need longer conversation that have been going on for quite a while that still haven't been addressed.
Theresa, congratulations on your publication in Native American and Indigenous Studies. That's such an exciting issue that has just come out. And thank you also for directing our attention to the Anton and Lee report on land grab universities. One thing that you shared with us today is that there are 10.7 million acres of Indigenous land that were spread across 24 states in order to create the universities that were established through the Morrill Act. Mm-hmm. And then you also talked to us about an idea that you've learned from Dr. Brian Brayboy, about trying to, I forget how you phrased it, but keeping universities to their word. And mm-hmm. So I'm curious about how you see those two ideas connected. Is the Morrill Act enough to try to keep universities to their word? Are we keeping them to their mission statements? Is their word any good around here? Like, how are you thinking about what it means to hold universities responsible?
Yeah, I mean, some institutions, they really rely on their reputation, and their prestige comes from their reputation. And so anything that puts the university at risk is of great concern because it'll affect their reputation. And so I know that, and I really appreciate the work of Tristan and Bobby, because it really put a lot of institutions on notice. It really made them scared that this research came out and that they would actually have to be accountable for something. I think it's time that I don't know, but I don't think that we've done a really good job of holding institutions accountable to their word. And I actually don't know if there's been any sort of commitments that have been made by institutions to Native people. You know, we have the most diverse higher education system in the country. There's about 3,000 public and private institutions across the whole nation. And so I don't know, you know, all of them and what commitments that they're making to Native people, but I don't know if institutions have thought about us. I don't know if they've like appropriately and adequately included us, and therefore I don't know if they've made commitments. But I do think it is we're at a time where we can hold institutions accountable to what they're saying or what they're not saying, right? So when they say like we care about all students in our campus community, we need to hold them accountable and call them out as to whether that includes Native people. You know, if they say like we want to do right, we need to ask them like, well, what does right mean to you? And that's something that I've started to do with my institution, is saying like, we want to do the right thing. And so you have to ask them like, well, what do you mean by the right thing? Is it the right thing by the institution, or is it the right thing by the community? In the case of repatriation and having this conversation, you know, is it the right thing to make sure the university isn't at risk, or is it the right thing for us to repatriate because that's actually what the community wants? And so I think, yeah, that we need to move to a place of holding institutions accountable and holding them to their word and what they say, and putting them in positions to make commitments to Native people. Because I don't think, but I don't know that they've really been doing that.
I wondered too about whether anybody anticipated how wealthy universities would become. How many universities have massive, I mean, we're talking about particular universities, but have massive endowments. Like, was that, what, you know, what does it mean to be hoarding wealth as a university that was established through the dispossession of Indigenous people from homelands? That to me is like a kind of incongruous way of existing and moving forward, especially as so many people are suffering now.
Mm-hmm. And I think something that people are not recognizing is with the Morrill Act, the first one and the second one, it was to create educational access for marginalized communities. And then in fact, it did the opposite. It resulted in exclusion, right? It resulted in the creation of segregated schools, HBCUs, right? And so it wasn't, the Morrill Act number 2 in 1890 wasn't to create HBCUs. It was to create an open access. And as a result, there was a clause in there that said, you know, separate but equal. So you could use the money to create a separate school for these communities. And it actually, someone's gonna, I'm gonna get raked over the coals for this comment. I could feel it. But it actually, it made things more segregated as opposed to increase educational equity and access for marginalized communities. I was something I will say, because you made a point, Eve. Institutions, I think, because of the High Country News expose, are really nervous. And within the last month, I was on a call with our president's council. And so they were saying, well, we looked at all the land plots, and none of the land plots that they found are associated with land that our institution currently owns. Right. And I said, well, I asked them, like, are you sure? Are you sure about that? You know, and that there was nervousness. And then I said, you need to look at the money. You need to look at the ledgers, because I don't think that our institution has a really, as a system, like we can even fathom the money and the benefit that we have raised on the sale of California Native land in particular, and how that has trickled down, and how it is so inequitable for our Native students in institutions today, right? Like, our Native students should have scholarships with no question. They should get a living wage, you know? They shouldn't have to relocate to better housing during a pandemic because university housing is so expensive. they shouldn't have to worry about whether they can actually pay for university housing because they're on a certain percent of a graduate student research assistantship or TA-ship. But in the meantime, our institution is like lining its coffers with money from the benefit of Indigenous land while our students are suffering, and our communities are being gravely affected by this pandemic too.
Another book that people might turn to in order to learn about the connections between slavery and the accumulation of wealth in the university is Ebony and Ivy from 2013. Craig Stephen Wilder's book is a book that people might want to think about in relationship to your presentation today.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we're just about at the end of our time. I'm not sure, Wayne, if you're going to try to, there's very broad, like big questions and very detailed questions in the chat here. And so I'm not sure what we're going to work with from the Q&A here, but I know that for my part of signing off today, one thing that I heard from you, Theresa, is the idea that universities need to do more, they need to do better, and that they need to do the right thing. And I'm so grateful to spend this time with you this afternoon. Wayne?
Yeah, I was just going to say to the people in the chat that it will be announced right after we get off in about a minute that there will be a debrief session where people will continue to talk about questions that arose today. And I'm sorry that we can't answer all of them. They were such great questions. And yes, and Theresa, I feel like we've spoken many times, but each time I gain new insights and I think new tools also for addressing what universities should be accountable to doing. So even this idea that every California Indian student, every Indigenous student should go to higher education for free. It's pretty obvious the way when you put it the way you've put it, and yet there's a way in which it has been categorized as in the same terms as other scholarships that has prohibited that. So that's just one of many things that you've pointed out. So thank you so much for your time and expertise today.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure and really nice talking with everybody and you both in particular.
All right. Congratulations on a complete talk. Rosa, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, thank you. And thank you once again to Dr. Ambo, Dr. Tuck, Dr. Yang, and Dr. Lawrence. This was such a wonderful discussion. And at the end of each of our events, I am left inspired, a bit emotional, but encouraged that the work that we're doing at DVC is helping us to go in the right direction. And I want to pick up on something that Dr. Ambo said, not in a diminutive way at all, but when you referred to yourself as a baby scholar, it really made me think of all of us as baby learners, and that we are in this process of re-educating, relearning, and hopefully we're going to do more than just read books together, but really dive into ways to improve our community together. And we appreciate you coming today to help us think that through and to learn together. And I also want to take a few seconds to thank a few other people. Once again, thank you to our tech team, Vanessa Darling, Christina Gomez, and Ligia Morcillo, who've done a fantastic job. To our DVC marketing team for creating our great marketing materials and websites. To the San Ramon campus partners, Rick and Diane and others for working with us on this event. Segurite Land Trust for partnering with us throughout this entire series and creating that great sense of community with us. And also our Women of Color Association, WOCA Student Club, for co-hosting the debrief circles that we have now had at the end of the week after our series. And we will have one this Friday, as has been mentioned. Here's the information, at 12:30 p.m. And if any students or other campus community members want to join, we can continue the discussion about today's talk. And that will be led by students, centered on students, and a great conversation. I also want to thank Maisie Richards, who has been a partner with us. She's come to several of our events, and she has created visual representations of each of our events that are on our website. Take a look at those. They're great summaries. And for our next event, lastly, on April 21st, we have Chelsea Vowell and Molly Swain, authors and activists, who will be talking about their work on a podcast, Métis in Space, which is an Indigenous feminist science fiction podcast that I think will be very intriguing for all of us. And we will send out information on that event. It will also be on the website so that you could register there. And we look forward to that discussion to round out our equity speaker series for this semester. And the last item is the survey. If you can take a second to complete the survey and give us feedback about today's event, we would greatly appreciate it. And we'll leave this up so that you can scan it on your phone or type in the tiny URL. Thank you once again, and we'll see you at the next event.